My guest today is Dr. Gregory Stebbins. Greg has a 40-year career coaching emerging and senior leaders. His own senior business leadership experience is combined with his in-depth understanding of the complex human consciousness found in a working environment. He is a member of the American Psychological Association and is a lifetime member of Sigma Xi, the Scientific Research Honor Society. He was selected to be a member of the Forbes Coaching Council and LinkedIn's ProFinder for executive coaching. He's a frequent contributor to Forbes online magazine on transcendent leadership and leadership wisdom. Dr. Stebbins is one of the co-creators of a master's degree program in transcendent leadership and an inaugural member of the Conscious Leadership Guild. He has an MBA in finance and a doctorate in education and psychology. So welcome, Greg, and thank you very much for coming and being a guest with Metaconscious Leaders.
I'm looking forward to our conversation, Greg.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you. I've been looking forward to this because this gives us an opportunity to look more at the being of leadership as opposed to the doing of leadership. There are plenty of skills courses around on, but your two books in particular, Leadership Wisdom, and before that, Transcendent Leadership, really go into those parts of leadership which don't really fit comfortably in metrics. So this is a great place to start, I think, which is, could you say something about your experience, your personal journey, and how that has formed and sort of set the foundation for the work you do now?
Well, before I jump into that, there's something you just said that's absolutely critical, and that is being leads doing. So who you are as a leader shows up long before people actually meet you, because your beingness or your character, if you want to use older terms, shows up long time before you show up. And no matter what you say or no matter what you do, people look at your state of being very, very closely to see if there's a match or a mismatch. In other words, if a leader says, if a person says the leader doesn't walk the talk, it's a statement saying that they're communicating one thing, but actually being another thing. So understanding who you are, that self-awareness is absolutely critical.
And people sense that, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. Even if they can't explain why they sense it, they do sense it. And I look at wisdom as a function of a balance and integration of three things: head, your intellect; hunch, your intuition; and heart, which many people classify as your emotions. So right now, we're sort of out of balance right now with all the artificial intelligence that's going on. People are just, it's a shiny new object and people are diving into it and testing it and seeing it. And they're sometimes forgetting their intuition, and many times they haven't really figured out what their heart is about. So it's out of balance and it needs to be balanced. Now, my leadership journey began very early in my life. And here's why. My father, his brother, and my grandfather were all West Point graduates. That's the United States Military Academy. So I was brought up with pretty strict expectations. And since my father was an officer, there was also an unwritten expectation that my brother and I would be leaders no matter what we did. So we had to learn that very quickly. And actually, the leadership goes back further than that. My great-grandmother's maiden last name is Whistler, and one of the first graduates out of the U.S. Military Academy in 1801 was Whistler, Colonel Whistler. And so there's about another 4 or 5 generations back then. So that's been part of my beingness, if you will. It's just incorporated into who I am. And I had to learn what parts that were working for me, and what parts weren't working for me. And then I went through the business environment while I was getting my doctorate and was a leader in various organizations. and then decided to get into the consulting business about 40 years ago. So I've been at this a while, and I continue to learn something new every day. I expect myself to learn more today than maybe you'll learn from me. So
Life's a two-way street, isn't it?
yeah, it is very much so, very much
Yeah.
so. And wisdom is actually emerges when a person learns from their experiences. So, but there's two sides to an experience. One is the objective viewpoint, and the other is the subjective viewpoint. An objective perception would be you and I would look at a person, let's say driving a car. And, if the person's sitting behind the steering wheel, their foot are on the pedals, and their hands on the gear shift, we can pretty accurately say they're driving a car, unless it's a Tesla and they're just faking it. So that's an objective experience. Now let's expand a little bit. Say you're driving down the street and a car cuts you off, cuts right in front of you. Your subjective experience might be upset, might be anger, might be wanting to call the police immediately and let them know there's a crazy person on the road. All of those are subjective experiences based on your history and what you believe and your programming. So we go through, from about 0 to 7 years old, we go through a process called imprinting. The good news is we learn like a sponge. The bad news is we have very little cognitive development, so we learn everything, and it gets programmed in. From about 7 or 8 to about 13, you go through a process called modeling. That's where you have an experience and you want to emulate that experience. So your parents want to give you some culture. They could take you to an art gallery. Of course, you're in the stage of modeling, and the first thing you want to do is replicate what you've seen. So you look for your box of 64 Crayolas and a blank canvas, usually the dining room wall, and proceed to draw pictures. Not all modeling efforts are successful. Then from about 13 to 21, you go through a process where you challenge all these behaviors and all these programming that's come in. And usually when I'm giving a seminar, I can tell who has kids that age because they're missing large chunks of hair, because the kids are challenging everything that they've been taught. Our prefrontal cortex, the part of us that makes decisions, doesn't really finish developing until we're about 26. So, we're an ongoing process. Then past that, past age 26, the only thing that really changes a person is if they have a significant emotional event. So that would be a marriage, it could be divorce, could be changing jobs, could be moving to a new city, something that's very significant to that person. So we're always a work in progress. The question is are our perceptions aligned with the organization we're working with? Essentially, that says our values align with the organization we're working with or not. And that's a lot of what I do with senior executives when I'm coaching. I find out the alignment and find out what their perceptions are versus the organization's perceptions. I have a good story for you if you're interested in it.
Yeah, please.
I was working with a CEO of a company, and he was changing the strategic direction of the company. And had everybody on his executive team lined up to make the change except the CFO. The CFO was absolutely against it. So I looked at him in our coaching process, and I said, you can always change out the CFO. And he looks at me and says, Greg, I really can't. I said, why is that? So the guy's my best friend. In fact, he was the best man at my marriage. So it's a little tough for me to change him out. So I looked at him and said, okay, so you need to really demonstrate your loving and caring for this gentleman by finding him a new job in a new company that's perfectly aligned with his values. Because he's no longer aligned with your values where you want to go. And he looked at me just astonished and said, I never thought about that. So that day he picked up the phone, started calling all his friends who were CEOs and even people he didn't know who were CEOs, looking for the perfect job for him. He actually found it. And they made the transition. He found a new CFO that was totally in alignment with the new game plan that they were playing. And so he kept his best friend and he made the change to his company. But only because he looked at it differently from a perceptual point of view and said, okay, rather than judge the CFO for having the wrong perceptual view, I need to find him a job where he's in alignment and find a new CFO who's in alignment with our values. And it worked perfectly.
Can I just go back a little while to your journey? Because one of the aspects of your journey has been a lot of meditation, hasn't it? And could you say a little bit about that? Because I think that's the basis of being. It's kind of who are we? You work with executives, you give them, you share your wisdom with them, you enable them to access their wisdom, but all of that sits on a foundation, on a base, on a platform of your being. How do you establish, or how have you established your beingness and your rootedness, if you like, in that being?
That's such a deep question. I'll do my best. I started to learn how to meditate when I was 17, and I'm 74 now. So it's been quite a few years. And then I started getting some formal instruction in meditation when I turned 19. And I just followed that instruction. Even doing something as simple as a breathing meditation where you focus on your breathing in and breathing out causes a person's whole body to relax, the mind to relax. And as I've explored layers, or what I call different aspects of consciousness, we have multiple levels. We're a multidimensional consciousness person. So we have our physical being, which is what most people focus on. What do I look like? What am I doing physically? And then just above that is the imagination. What am I imagining? Then we get into the emotions. Then we get into the mind. And then we get into an area called the subconscious and unconscious. And here's the difference. Subconscious is like your hall closet where you have raincoats and umbrellas and that kind of stuff stored. You know it's there. You know you can access it whenever you want to access it. Then there's the unconscious, which is like the stuff we store up in the attic or down in the basement. It's there, but we've totally forgotten what's there. But the interesting thing is what's stored in your unconscious actually provides an override to all the other things that you want to do. But most of us aren't unconscious about it. Occasionally we get the opportunity to reflect on that, usually about 4:00 in the morning. And that's, your mind wakes you up and says, hey, we need to think about this. And you go, I'll get it in the morning. Of course, the morning arrives and you don't even think about it because you don't even remember it. So the whole focus of meditation is becoming aware of those levels of consciousness. And then above those are what we call the spiritual levels, or what I sometimes refer to as the authentic levels, who you really are beyond that, beyond these other little aspects. And for probably the last 40 years of my meditation practice, that's what I've been focused on, is becoming much more aware of that. I know that when I first started to learn how to meditate, the mind would kick in and go, I'm hungry, let's go get a sandwich. Or the emotions would throw up something that is unresolved, that might have had some sort of strong emotional to it. And I'd try to solve it, but I couldn't solve it in that because you need a face-to-face to do that. So a lot of the self-awareness is testing these things and beginning to understand how they show up in your life and how they work in your life. And that has been a big piece for the underlying part of what I do in coaching.
And how did that impact on your behavior, on how you show up in the world? What would people have noticed about you after you had been meditating for some time as opposed to before?
You develop a level of intuitive insight where your intuition becomes very strong and you begin to anticipate things that might happen to you, which gives your mind a chance to work out scenarios. So it's what I would call internal scenario planning. But until you have that intuitive insight, you're kind of just hoping with hope. And so that became very valuable. And you're in a conversation and something happens and you go, wait a minute, something just happened. What is it that just happened? So that's the intuition. The insight is you've done this, you've had this experience before, you know what possibilities might come from it. You do a little game plan on that, but still keep your mind open for what may show up. So that's the biggest thing. Intuitive insight is, or what I call a hunch, shows up much more frequently and much more powerfully.
So is that the same, for instance, as the way I experience it is I will go to sleep at night with a question, which I'll deliver to my unconscious, and I'll wake up in the morning, and sometimes the first thought that comes to mind is, or at 4 o'clock in the morning, I'll awake and I go ping, yeah, okay, that's it.
Yeah. So what I started doing was just have a tape recorder next to my bed, because I can't read my handwriting anyway. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, who knows what it is? It just looks like scribbles. But I could understand what I was saying into the tape recorder most of the time. Sometimes it's just a mumble, but I've learned to speak more clearly. So that becomes just another technique, but it's, as you say, it's a behavior change. Once I started having that awareness, I started leveraging that awareness and started changing the behaviors I did to support that new awareness.
So where does that message come from? Where does that thought come from? Is it from our own unconscious? Is it from what Jung would describe as the collective unconscious?
It's actually above the collective unconscious. Here's the way I describe how we progress. Let's just use the word soul. I know not everybody uses that, but let's use the word soul. And we come into these lower levels to have experience. And that's to gain awareness about ourselves. So if you think of a pool of water as the dividing line between all those aspects of consciousness and soul, that's the dividing line. And so you stick your head in that water and you start looking down to the bottom of the creek, which is the physical level. And so you start gaining experience of seeing what's there and interacting with what's there, et cetera, et cetera. But often, probably 90% of the population has forgotten that they're looking down through these levels. So when you forget, you end up trapping yourself in these levels. The process of meditating on the upper levels helps pull the consciousness out. And so you have a direct connection with who you really are.
So do you advise executives, leaders to meditate? Is that something that you include in your practice? And very simply, for those people who are watching, what would be an easy way or a straightforward way of doing this on their own bat as opposed to getting instruction?
I advise them to do at least 30 seconds. And even if the 30 seconds is just totally focusing on their breath. Now, most executives I find are not real present in the current reality. They're often in their head thinking about stuff. They're often in their emotions trying to work stuff out. They're actually not even very, very involved in their imagination. I've met a lot of executives that have trouble imagining what to have for lunch, much less imagining their business. So they're mostly reactive to what goes on in their business. So there's an exercise that I recommend occasionally that is a real challenge for a lot of executives. And that's where you put 100 toothpicks in front of you and a pile of 10 toothpicks, and pick up each toothpick one at a time and just look at it and say, I'm here now. Set the toothpick aside. Once you go through all 100, you pick up one of the 10 and lay off to the side. The objective is to reach 1,000 toothpicks. Here's a process that most people go through. About the 10th toothpick, they look at it and they go, why am I holding a toothpick? They've totally forgotten what they're trying to do. And then they get through that eventually. They get about to the 20th toothpick, and that's when all the doubt creeps in. This is stupid. This is crazy. This isn't doing anything. I can't tell anything. No, you really can't tell anything at that point. especially when you say you can't tell anything because you now set up a rule for yourself. So then you get past that and you come on, and probably about the 30th or 40th toothpick, you actually fall asleep. You go unconscious because you worked your way up to the unconscious, but the unconscious is unconscious. It's aptly named. So then maybe you get to the 100th toothpick and you go, aha, I can take one out of the pile of 10 and put it over here. And eventually, let's say maybe after 2 or 3 months, you finally do all 1,000. But you will be so focused on what's right in front of you that stuff creeps in that you wouldn't even notice before that you'll notice. Something will happen in your business that's really an alarm bell that goes off that you never noticed before, but you notice it. And then you have the experience of correcting that. If you're really good at it, you can just pick one up and that'll do it. But that's usually after you've done several thousand, you get used to what's doing it. I was giving a seminar one time, and one of the students was challenging me unconsciously about staying present. So I just moved into a total presence with him. And he would drift off. I said, okay, you're drifting off. He goes, how can you tell that? I said, that's easy. I'm still present. You're not. I can notice that. And then he was really working on staying present. I looked at him and said, it's not easy, is it? He goes, no, it's not easy. It gets easier when you practice it.
It's a form of meditation, presumably, isn't it?
Well, 30 seconds of meditation for most people is a long time. My average right now is about 2 hours a day. So, but I wouldn't ever suggest a new person trying to do meditation 2 hours. They go nuts.
Because there's one of the ways I look at it is there's meditation, and there's also momentary meditation, which is what you mentioned there. And I have a discipline which is whenever I see, there are so many digital clocks around, whenever I see 11:11 or 10:10 or 09:09, any of those where the minute matches the hour, I stop for a minute and go inside. And
that would be a form of meditation.
And it's very interesting as well how sometimes the synchronicity works. And on one particular day, which was very significant for me for a number of different reasons, I clocked something like 8 or 9 times the hour and the minute.
It's sort of like once you're conditioned to see something, you'll start noticing it more often. And what will happen is because you've conditioned yourself, the unconscious will look at a clock right at that time period.
Okay, Greg. And you mentioned in your book, Wise Leadership, you mentioned in there, which is connected really to the meditation aspect, that silence, the topic, silence speaks, and you quote here Rumi, let silence speak to you about the secrets of the universe. And you mentioned this as being a portal to opening wisdom and also to hearing the heart or listening to the heart. Could you talk a little bit about the heart and about the science around the heart? Because I think you mentioned in there about, you don't refer to heart math, but the heart brain and the connection between the heart and the brain. And is this where you're talking about heart wisdom?
Yeah. So if we look at head, hunch, and heart, and essentially we have 3 brains. The head brain, pretty much everybody knows about, and the hunch, you've heard the term gut instinct. It's because of the number of acetylcholine transfers that take place in the gut, which is part of consciousness. And the same acetylcholine transfers take place in the heart as well. So the heart has its own brain. A lot of people think the head is in charge, but actually the research says the heart communicates with the brain, and the heart is in charge. And if we look at ancient medicine, they've always looked at it as the heart as being in charge. It's only really been in the last 300, 400 years that we've focused on the head and focused on consciousness of the head and decision making, etc. So there are neuron transfers between the heart and the brain are bidirectional, but more information comes through the heart to the brain than comes back the other way. So someone is really conditioned and geared to something going on in the heart, it will override the brain. So here's an extreme example. Let's say two prisoners of war with the threat of being executed. And one person realizes that they could save the other person by becoming totally responsible, and the other person would be let go, even though it might not be true. And in those cases, we find the heart taking over and risking everything. But in a sense, if we are, if we go back to the soul looking through the water, there is no destruction. We never die. The aspects of consciousness die. Yes, they do. They get recycled and reworked. But who you are inside, that essence of yourself, never dies. In fact, that essence of yourself is connected with everything. And that's where the concept of oneness comes in. So if we look at our consciousness being heart-centered, we'll be more authentic about who we are and what we're about than if we're coming from just pure intuition or pure thought.
So are you connecting consciousness with the heart as opposed to consciousness with the brain?
Let's just use the word primary consciousness. Let's use the word essence, the essence of who we are. Okay, I would use the word soul, but that's just me. Essence is a great word.
So what for you is consciousness?
What for me is consciousness? Is the authentic essence of who I am.
Which is non-physical.
Non-physical, it's non-mental, non-unconscious, non-emotional, non-imagination, non-physical.
And it's reflected, or our physical body, does it emerge from that? Does it reflect that that is conscious?
Yeah, it's a little complex because there's a lot of aspects that go into constructing your physical body. Something that's probably going to be shocking to some of your listeners. We probably work a lot of that out at a spiritual level with the people who are going to be our parents. So when somebody says, well, I never chose my parents, I go, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, maybe you don't remember. So you come in and you got certain things, and you came in to experience certain things. So some people only come in to experience what goes on at a physical level because they're at a very baseline awareness, self-awareness. Some people come in having experienced a lot of those things and become very aware of their essence and operate in a different way.
So our bodies in a way enable us to, well, our brain does something, our heart does something, our gut does something. And if we live in one particular part, let's say we're very left brain and we're focused very much in planning, in what's happening, what's going on, the actions. So we can be focused on actions and doing. We can be focused also on our heart and a different aspect of knowledge, a different aspect of knowing, of being. The same with our gut, which is like the intelligence of the body informing us in a way that is not linguistic.
Right.
It's not necessarily logical, but it is intelligent.
So that's why I make the statement that wisdom is the integration and balance between those three things. So you integrate your brain, your mind, you integrate your hunch, your intuitive insights, and you integrate your heart. And once all three of those are integrated, then you have a more complete picture. Maybe not totally complete because you really need to integrate your essence. but not too many people really know how to do that.
Where does the essence come in?
The essence is always there. We either look at it or we don't look at it. A lot of people say, Spirit has abandoned me. I said, maybe you need to turn around 180 degrees and find out who really abandoned who.
How do you bring that into your coaching?
I usually bring it in sort of undefined because it's too much for some people, and I don't want to put them on and have themselves beat themselves up. See, the wisdom development process requires self-inquiry. You need to ask yourself about yourself. But a lot of people do self-inquisition instead. They beat themselves up. Then the second part is once you've inquired about something, you need to reflect on it. But people don't do self-reflection. They do self-rejection instead. And that doesn't get them anywhere. So if you really do inquire about yourself and you do reflect on yourself, the next phase is probably something called contemplation. Contemplation is different than meditation. Contemplation is you hold something and let it expose itself to you. So like you're holding a rose in your hand and you go, what is a rose? I don't know. Let's reflect on a rose. Okay, I got the reflection. Let's let the rose explore itself and reflect itself to me. Now that sounds like double talk. And most people look at you like you're half crazy with that. Except the whole process of contemplation, actually, there's a book written about 1200. Can't remember the guy's name, but he wrote a book on spiritual exercises. And he has self-reflection, self-inquiry, self-reflection, contemplation, meditation, and prayer as the 5 pieces of spiritual exercises. And I found that's a pretty good explanation of what I do.
One of the reasons I started with Metaconscious Leaders, and it kind of arose out of Transcendent Leadership, which was a book that you wrote a couple of years ago, and which I read, and that was when I first got in touch with you. Because the thing that strikes me is that we are currently the world is, and humanity is in a place of deep crisis at the moment. We have multiple existential challenges, and what is required of us now is extraordinary development, change, adaptation, and you refer to it in your book as transcendent leadership. I mean, I think that for me, transcendent leadership is saying, go to the next level. What is the next level of leadership? Because only by going to a higher level of leadership do we then get to master what we need to master in order to be able to overcome the challenges that we face, both at a practical level, but also at a mental and a social level as well.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether you see the same, but I seem to think that metaconscious is kind of another term for transcendent consciousness.
Yeah, I think so too. When we talk about transcendent, we look at the word. Transcend means to rise above. Simply put it. We look at leadership in the last, say, 120 years, well, 130 years. Before the turn of the last century, leadership was called the great man theory because only men could be leaders and then only great men could be leaders. And then the Industrial Revolution happened and we became transactional in our leadership. You show up, you do these things, I will pay you. That's a transaction. Don't tell me about your problems at work or at home or anything like that. I don't care about that. And then in the late 40s, Abraham Maslow brought forward humanistic psychology. And that's where transformational leadership started. And Maslow's hierarchy of needs ended at self-actualization, where you become very aware of yourself. But most people don't know that in 1969, he published a whole thought process on transcendence and actually gave a couple lectures on it. So he was really the founding father of not only transformational leadership, but transcendent leadership as well. But not too many people know that. So if you've looked at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the pyramid, self-actualization is actually generally put at the top. But actually, according to Maslow, transcendence is at the top, where you transcend all those lower levels and you come into a different level of consciousness. Now, it's interesting, Maslow came up with that because he was very anti-religious. But he had to stop and say, wait a minute, there's something more. And he died shortly after it was published. So he brought it forward when he was the president of the American Psychological Association. And at that time, the concept of love and loving was not really well accepted. There's one psychologist that talks about the unconditional positive regard. And I have a couple of friends who had lunch with him, and they asked him, he said, didn't you really mean love? And he smiled and he said, yeah, but I couldn't say that back in 1950.
Was this Rogers?
Yeah. So we're sort of still in that stage. You talk to a lot of senior leaders, the whole concept of love is just foreign and not accepted, because they usually have the definition of love tied up with a relationship. For me, love is tied up with caring about yourself and caring about other people. I had one senior executive say, self-love, aren't you talking about being narcissistic? I said, no, that's a completely different thing. Narcissism is, where you're making no room for anybody else and you're the only one who has that. And that's not self-caring, and it's not caring for other people.
Yeah, narcissism, I would say, is selfishness where I perceive myself as being a physical body. Exquisite selfishness is when I identify myself as being part of one organism, oneness, and then my interests are your interests, and therefore why would I do anything other than serve?
Yeah, there's another piece to it too. It's not only that you're selfish, it's you're selfish in a way that there's no other person who could possibly meet that. So you're exclusive as well.
Elaborate on that a little bit.
So if you're narcissistic, you have a superiority point of view. So it's, I'm the only one and everybody else is less than me. That's classic case. And, we have a president in the United States who demonstrates that aptly.
Reflecting on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it strikes me that our generation or our culture has kind of got stuck on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's got over the physiological issues, it's got over the security issues, and it's got into a place of very comfortable social self-esteem kind of place, and it doesn't want to move from there. And it might aspire to self-actualization, but the transcendent bit, for me, I understood that was kind of in the upper triangle or pyramid, reflected, so beyond the apex of the pyramid. And to reach that realization, one's got to give up, let go of, become unattached to all the things below, because one's realization at that point is that one is not the physical being, one is something greater than, something more permanent, not permanent, eternal. So consciousness, consciousness being reality. And what I mean there by reality is that it's that which doesn't change.
Yeah.
And we got stuck in this in this comfortable little bit in the middle of the pyramid, and we don't seem to be moving forward. And it's almost as if the situation that we now find ourselves in, we have created because we're not evolving. And it comes back to this leadership. The next stage in leadership being to go to transcendent leadership, to go to a meta-conscious level where we go above, we transcend the difficulties and the challenges and the habits that we've got into.
There is 100% cure for people who do not want to move into transcendence.
And what is that?
It's called death. And what I'm doing now is I'm actually noticing that a lot of emerging leaders naturally move to transcendence and naturally move beyond that. And they don't even think about it, they just do it. And it's fascinating for me, and it's enjoyable because I get to work with them. I get them to understand the experiences that they're having and how those experiences work and how they don't work, and what's their perception versus what the reality is and that kind of thing.
So I'm really glad you brought up this topic. I was having a meeting with a client of mine, and we were having dinner, and he said, "Oh well, Greg. Anyway, so what's going on with you and life? What are you up to?" And I said, "Oh, I'm preparing to die." And he was utterly shocked. And then I realized that he might have thought I had some terminal illness that I hadn't told him about. So I put him straight on that. But once we were over that, we had this conversation about when I get, let me own it, when I get to consider my dying and what it actually is, it helps me enormously to identify with who I am, and also to get over it.
Yeah.
And I find myself feeling more alive, more positive about living than if I don't consider it, if I ignore it. And I really want to be in a position where when I do die, I am happy. I'm happy about it. No, I'm prepared for it as much as I possibly can be, rather than being in a position where I fear it, and therefore I'm not living properly because I'm then living in fear because I'm trying to avoid the risk.
Well, there is no risk, especially if you move to the higher levels, because there just is. There's a pure state of being at that point. One of the things that I'm noticing with young leaders, they'll come into a company, and if there isn't some effort in the company to really help them educate themselves on being a better leader and being willing to listen to the continuity of consciousness, which you're talking about, they leave. We had a series of events in the United States called quiet quitting, where they would come in and start work for a while, and they go, "This culture is not what I want to be involved with," and they would quit, even though it might have been the perfect job, perfect salary, perfect learning experience. They were not in alignment with the culture that was there. And that was especially true for organizations that had oppressive cultures, which is probably the vast majority. So it's part of the learning experience that these kids are going through. And I'm just happy that I've had an opportunity to work with them.
So what age of emerging leaders, when you refer to emerging leaders, you're referring to younger leaders, presumably. And what kind of age are you talking about? Is this Gen Z?
It's sort of like the last vestiges of Generation X and all of Gen Z. And Generation A that's just becoming teenagers, they have problems with school, that is very dominant and controlling.
So this is where leadership is evolving to then,
Yeah.
to a higher level, to transcendent level, to metaconscious level, is what you're saying. Because as you eloquently put just now, leadership going from the big man to transactional and through to transformational and so forth. And the next stage is the higher level of consciousness, transcendence, and evolutionary or as generations evolve, that is coming into play, and it's coming into play with the new generations, is what you're experiencing.
Yeah. You talked about the world seems to be going through crisis now. I would submit that the world was already in crisis, and now we're seeing it make the transition to a different way of being. So Will that mean no more wars? No, there'll always be wars because there's still people coming onto the planet who have no experience. And so they still have to experience all these things. But what may happen is wars become very localized. So an example of that would be Vietnam. Vietnam has had wars in that country for thousands of years. You look at the history of it, and now it's beginning to make a change. There's a couple in Vietnam that interviews a lot of the top people. I was fortunate enough to be interviewed by them, and they are focused on this whole what's the next generation, what's the next step for mankind. So, in a sense, all you need is love is really ahead of its time, but it's now in time.
So, loving. You talk in your book about loving, and we mentioned a little earlier love being unconditional positive regard. Can you talk a little bit about how you work with leaders to bring loving into an organization and the impact that has on the performance of the group?
Well, there's two steps to it. One is, have you ever had an experience where someone loved you unconditionally? And essentially, people either go back to one of their two parents. Either their father loved them unconditionally, or usually the mother loved them unconditionally. They say, describe to me what that means. And so they go through the description. And then I ask them, was there any romance involved? They go, no, of course not. I said, right. How come you have it wired up in your head that way? And they go, oh. And that becomes the level of self-awareness. I said, so your mom or your dad took care of you, made sure everything was working for you, and spent a lot of time with you. Could you do that with the people who work for you? Yeah, I could do a lot more of that. Great. So then you move into what's called loving leadership. Not that you find somebody to have romance with, but somebody that you care deeply for and help them. And once they get that, then they go, what would unconditional be like for you? Oh, I don't know, Greg. I'm not sure I could do unconditional. Okay, well, let's just suppose. What would it mean to be unconditional? And then I give them the Thomas Watson example. Thomas Watson was the CEO of IBM. And one of his vice presidents made a mistake, cost the company $1 million. And that was in the 30s when $1 million meant something. And he got called into the office in Thomas Watson, and Thomas Watson looks at him and said, do you know why you're here? And the guy said, I guess I'm here to get fired because I just lost $1 million. Thomas Watson looks at him and says, fired? I just spent $1 million on your education. Why would I fire you? And that totally changed the conversation. That's an example of unconditional. Would Thomas Watson call it unconditional loving? I don't know, but I do.
And love in the context that we're talking about it here, unconditional positive regard, provides a safety net, a safe environment, a safe place, a safe space, which then enables us to be vulnerable. Yep. And you bring this into your book as well. Can you elaborate on a little bit on that and how vulnerability is a part of that? And I just love the way that there's almost a dance going on between growth and love and vulnerability and so forth. Say a little bit about that.
Vulnerability, especially in leadership, has a lot to do with humility. There's a professor in a college in Texas who he asked me some questions. I gave him some thoughts about. He wrote a book called Humongous, or he combined humility with courageousness and came up with this word. So when we talk about that, we're talking about vulnerability and being willing to admit that you made a mistake, which a lot of executives don't want to do. They give you something else to think about while the mistake goes on. It's almost like they're trying to be professional politicians, but they don't have the votes yet. So, tied into this is a concept called judgment. We're told to be very good thinkers and judges of character. The problem is when you judge somebody, you literally block communication with that person. And when you judge yourself, you block the internal communication that you could be having about yourself. So if you choose humility, going, you know what? I did something really stupid, and here it is in all of this flaming glory. You know, then people say, yeah, you did something really stupid. Great, that's the end of it. Because you both admitted it. You both made a definition of it. But if you're the executive, go, and here's what I learned from that. See, executives seem to have a lot of experiences. The problem is they don't learn from them. So they repeat the experience over and over and over again. And that eventually costs the company too much money because you're repeating the same experience. One of my early teachers made the comment to me, he says, I don't care what failures you have, just let that be the only one of that type. So I needed to learn how to learn from those experiences. I wasn't always successful, but I learned how to learn. And so now I look at the experiences, and my first question is, what am I learning from this? Maybe it is something unconditional. Maybe it is something that has to do with humility. Maybe it is something to be have empathy with or compassion with. But the empathy and compassion and loving starts internally, because if you haven't built that up, it's going to be very difficult for you to exhibit that in the working environment.
And that centeredness that you develop internally enables you to perform with much greater clarity and conviction and power, actually, on externally, doesn't it? And the things that you're talking about there, the loving, the vulnerability, that safe environment, builds resilience as well, which is so valuable, especially in times like these.
Yeah, in a sense, when you really div yourself, the self empathy, the self compassion, the self loving, especially the self loving is unconditional. It's like you build a reservoir that you can tap into whenever you need to tap into it, and provide that for another person. And another person will say, where do you get this stuff from? I build it inside myself first, and then it's available. And what's available is the overflow from that, because I'm constantly adding to that and constantly have an overflow. And the overflow ends up becoming a ripple inside an organization. And so you walk into some organization, or at least I do, and you go, wow, there must be some really alive people who are leading this organization, because you can feel the ripples.
This goes back to what you were saying a little earlier about how people sense your state of being.
Yeah.
And when we really ground something, when leaders really ground a self-knowing within themselves, there is no talk about it in a way. They don't have to tell people. It comes across. It radiates. It's an energy. It's an aura. I'm thinking now of some other issues that need addressing. I'm thinking of cooperation versus competition. I'm thinking of the language of our society and of our companies, of our culture, which is around conflict. It's, we fight for this, we fight for that, we fight for the next thing. It's win or lose. We fight against nature, we fight against the environment, we fight for peace. We fight our cancer, we fight our diseases. We're at war with most everything that we engage with. And I think the power of your teachings and what you're putting in your books is that it starts to open the lid on other aspects which aren't in competition. They're in cooperation. And that's something which, especially in a complex world, we need to have more of.
The the world as it is today, and that's changing, as you mentioned at the very beginning of our session, is really built on transaction. Okay. And the idea of a transaction is somebody wins and somebody loses because they haven't seen how everybody wins. Now, you can't have that, everybody wins, because it wouldn't be a transaction. There's always a winner and a loser. So, and that's part of, yeah, that's part of the consciousness that's evolving. You won't get cooperation until we begin to see that, hey, it's a zero sum game and we're all in it to win the same way. So maybe you win because you've sacrificed something so another person can have something. And I'm starting to see videos of that in LinkedIn where there's a person walks up, hands a person a 100 euro bill, and walks away. Doesn't identify who they are, doesn't identify their beingness in any way. They just gave it because they recognize the person's having a hard time. We're starting to see examples of that more and more and more on, I love looking at Facebook and YouTube reels and seeing what they have. I especially like the animals, foxes and bears, and especially birds. House I lived in, we had pet jays that would land in our hands and take nuts from our hands. It took about 6 months to train them to do that, but it was great. And then we had squirrels that just did it automatically.
There is extraordinary intelligence, isn't there,
Yeah.
in nature?
Yeah, if you've ever tried to prevent a squirrel from feeding at a bird feeder, it's impossible. You can put all the contraptions up, they figure out how to do it.
Yeah, done that. By adopting or putting into practice what you have in your books, Wise Leadership, Transcendent Leadership, A Loving Environment, is it possible for a leader to operate in a complex situation without stress?
Yes, it is. There's a Japanese slogan that's probably appropriate for this. None of us is smarter than all of us. And so leaders adopt a mindset that, hey, I'm a leader, I should solve all this. Well, maybe not. Maybe if you love your people enough that they felt safe really talking about possibilities, they may come up with a perfect solution that you never thought of. Like the executive I worked with, I said, you need to find your friend a job. He never would have thought of that. But because he was paying me, I guess he thought it was okay, I should listen to this guy. But you're paying the people who work for you, you better be listening to them because they're closer to the problem than you are. They probably have a solution, but don't feel safe in presenting it. So that's another aspect of loving leadership. You create an environment that's safe for people to take that next step. And if you have them take the next step and they come up with solutions that work, you're going to take a lot of stress off your head. The concept of problems in your gut, or heart attacks, and that kind of stuff begin to diminish greatly because you're not putting stress on the body.
What's your worldview? How would you describe your faith, if I can use that word?
My faith comes from the experience that I've had above the unconscious level. So my faith comes from essence. I'll probably give you a little history here. My family was raised in the Episcopal Church, which is part of the English Church, and my sister is actually the bishop of the state of Montana for the Episcopal Church. So we have some lively conversations you might expect, and generally her thought process and my thought process is very, very close to one another. That what we really need to focus on is other people's essence focus on our essence and becoming more aware of that, focus on other people's essence and helping them become more aware of that, and then allowing that shared essence to come forward where you really have that oneness. Because from my perspective, we all come from the same source.
So that's the oneness. I heard this idea that in any situation, we can ask ourselves the question, who am I identifying with, or who am I in this moment? And the question can basically be, or in simple terms, come down to, I am this body, I am this person, I am a separate being, I am needing to survive, I am needing to do X, Y, and Z, or I am my essence. I am more than, as well as being a separate human being, I am also one with the entire universe, the cosmos.
You could take those additional definitions off and just make a simple statement, I am.
I am. Mm.
And that pretty much says everything.
Yeah. You've probably seen Jill Bolte Taylor's TED Talk, and there when she finishes up, she talks about being in two states, or being aware of those two states at the same time, or bringing the transcendent into the present moment whilst fulfilling some bodily task.
Yeah, in a sense, you're being aware of your transcendence. And then once you become aware of that, that sort of overrides everything else that's going on. So, yeah, you're still doing stuff in the world, but you're doing it from a different state of consciousness.
And that brings with it all of those things that we've been talking about, resilient, loving.
Yeah. And once you really connect in with the loving, the concept of making your next $1 million doesn't hold much water because you realize that you're above that, you're above the transaction. And the joy and the loving that comes forward from your heart just becomes more fulfilling than anything that you could get on a physical level.
So this is where the work that you're doing and the books that you're writing are guiding the leaders that you work with.
Yeah.
And it's your purpose, is it?
Well, it's certainly shown up to be that. This last book, the Transcendent, the Loving Wisdom book, literally took me 2 years to write. Probably because I was going, oh, no one's going to buy this. And I had to get through that. I had to transcend that transactional perspective. So, it's not because I'm any great shakes. I am. I'm going through my own process. I'm sharing that process. I'm sharing my experiences with you.
Well, thank you very much, Greg, for doing that, because it's a wonderful book. And I also would recommend this book as well, which is Transcendent Leadership.
Thank you. It's been a wonderful conversation for me. I love the questions you ask and where we're meandering around it.
So, Greg, is there anything else that you would like to say? And where can people read more about what you do, what you offer? Where can people find you?
Actually, they can reach out to me via email, which is greg@peoplesavvy.com. And that's SAVVY.
Okay,
So,
well, I'll put all those details in the footnotes so that people can get that along with your website and the books. So.
Yeah. And all the books are available on Amazon. So
Right.
it's the easiest thing to do. There is another book. I don't know if you've read it. It's called People Savvy for Leaders. It doesn't go quite into the depth that the Transcendent Leadership and the Wise Leadership do, but it does talk a lot about how to relate to other people, which I call relational wisdom. So, but that book was written probably 20 years ago. Transcendent Leadership book was written, I think it was published in 2016 or 2017. And then the Wise Leadership was published this year.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg, very much. And we'll get you back again in the future, because I think that it would be really good to blend different approaches. Because as you said a little earlier, we can learn from each other. There are some guests who I'll get onto the podcast, and some of their thoughts, I would love to come back and discuss those with you, and see how you resonate with those.
Yeah, I'd love that too. We learn
Okay,
from each other.
we do. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.